we've got 2 weeks left. I hope that we're following this like super mechanical scheme that is pre-programming stuff to a certain extent, and so we're right on the downslope now, where we have to deal with everything we're going to talk about in the whole of this course, and right now this week we're back on. I'll say paperclipper, but what I'm going to do today is really try and open that up as much as possible. I think it's huge. And I think it's also worth introducing a bit of larger context in that we end up back on intelligence explosion next week. And part of what I really hope to get across, if people aren't persuaded already of this, is that these two things belong together philosophically in a very, I think, interesting way. And that so I'll sort of introduce a little bit today why I think that is, and we'll get from the other side next time. Okay, so the more general and slowly hone in structure like that. So the most general thing and the basic claim that I want to advance for discussion and controversy here is that the two most fundamental threads of this cultural formation that we've been looking at, the kind of building blocks, the pillars of the virtual Anthropol entity, consist on the one hand of what is generally called the orthogonality thesis, which we obviously encountered last time we came across the paperclipper, and on the other side of the what's we've been calling, or at least in the references that have been running alongside of, has been calling the FOOM model of intelligence explosion. So, in an absolute nutshell, it seems to me that those two threads or themes or pillars do not coordinate, that they do not actually form a coherent structure, and they're actually mutually exclusive options. And as soon as saying that, I think from a sort of critical philosophy point of view, there's then the immediate temptation to look for the concealed diagonal argument in that structure. And so that's going to be a kind of underlying research initiative that's taking place in these final stages, or reaching a consummation of some kind in these final stages. And again, very briefly at this point, because we'll get back to it. But I think the reason that they don't coordinate is that the whole discourse of friendly AI and AI security has to cross over when it starts talking about one, or when it starts talking about the other, into a completely different structure of thinking. And it's quite intriguing, and itself, I think, a really interesting symptom of what's happening, and of certain cultural and traditional intellectual structures that are underlying it, that this can happen at all. I mean, it seems to me odd that it doesn't strike people as more obviously contradictory. So why is this? Well, I think the reason is that the only reason that anyone would get started with the FOOM model, with the notion of intelligence explosion, is an extremely intense notion of reflexivity. That AI is considered something that is potentially explosive because of the fact that it enters into a dynamic of self-improvement. And obviously the intellectual foundations of this are laid extremely solidly already in the IJ Good paper that we've continually referred to. Um, the only reason it explodes is it puts together a certain kind of regenerative positive circuit in which the more it improves itself, the more its capacity to improve itself is itself improved. And so we get into this extreme nonlinear dynamic. Um, and with that comes a lot of the security threat aspect. That's to say, it happens so fast, it completely um, um, outpaces the capacity to respond. And as we've talked about before, that pushes the whole discourse of AI security into this preemptive model, that if you allow things to reach that trigger threshold, then you've already lost the um, the game, I say, the war, whatever seems the most appropriate thing. The problem is already insoluble at the point it actually gets initiated. So when we turn back to the orthogonality thesis, all of this seems to suddenly disappear. I think it's worth keeping as our kind of model for this the paperclipper. The paperclipper wants to maximize the output of paperclips. Paperclipper is obviously a shorthand for paperclip maximizer. We've seen that there's a whole bunch of analogical AI monsters that go along with this. And it immediately jumps out from this that there is nothing directly connecting the fundamental imperative of the paperclipper with self-improvement. It's actually, the orthogonality thesis is a thesis implicitly of non-reflexivity. It's that there can be a completely arbitrary, dominating goal of some intelligence that has nothing whatsoever to do with its own capacity for self-improvement. And that capacity for self-improvement is delegated to the Omohundro basic drives issue, where it does figure for sure. But then it tends to be that when people introducing the orthogonality thesis go through this route, talk about basic drives, they do it only to cover that ground and bracket it off as a special case. So if you have an intelligence explosion, you cannot have an orthogonal monstrosity. I mean, this is the argument that I would very much welcome pushback on. It seems to me crystal clear that these two things simply cannot be brought together into the same conceptual space. It can be, you can say this in lots of different ways. I mean, one way to say it is that the actual genetic conditions of superintelligence set constraints upon its structural characteristics. It by the very nature that it has to have actually appeared, it has to have been produced, and by far the most important model of that production, as I say, is this catalytic, self-improving, explosive model. If that's the way it's produced, then it has to be that its basic purposive orientation is towards self-improvement. It is simply not, the option is not left open that its basic orientation is towards the maximization of paperclips or any other arbitrary goal. This seems to me hugely important because it seems, setting it up like this, and in the way we've obviously done it like this, like a kind of parochial concern that comes up in a very odd little microculture centered in the sort of American Silicon Valley AI fraternity. But I don't think that's at all realistic. I think that we're talking about something extremely fundamental that goes to the very basis of what we can call the value distinction, the distinction between is and ought, or in a very influential way talked about as the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy, of course, being that you think that you can use matters of fact in an ethical, and I think that could be extended to political argument. And this is G. Moore describes that as a fallacy, and it's widely accepted as a fallacy, and the orthogonalists all accept that it's a fallacy, and their position is based on that. So the question then is, well, how deep does this fact value distinction go? You know, how constrained is that as a sort of intellectual and philosophical problem? My inclination would say it's vast, and so vast that it actually clicks onto another running theme that we've had, which is the question about what is man. Now, what is man, again, is huge, ultimately expandable, but we're forced into it through the purely strategic considerations of the Anthropol Institute, in the sense that it is given a brief. Its fundamental strategic directive is to protect man. I don't think that you can conceive an X-risk without some relation to that. And a lot of, you know, talking, I think, especially to Amy, who was a kind of bridge here to some other stuff that is not directly represented. This question about the nature of man, what is man, the definition of man, is a crucial bridging question between a whole series of different discourses and concerns and political orientations, and therefore it's by anything but a trivial consideration. And so the secondary postulate that I'd want to advance on this is that man, in the sense that the Anthropol Institute has to adopt the term, is inextricable from a particular conservative stance on the fact value distinction. Man is that being irreducibly that can distinguish facts and values, and at the point that that capability is dissolved, there is a dissolution of man, and that dissolution of man means that it's impossible then to formulate any kind of coherent strategic orientation in relation to AI. I think some of the things that Joel has been saying, I think, ties up a lot with that, because there's clearly a position that I think is in a perhaps different way shared by the left accelerationists, that our notion of man should be so flexible that it really cannot serve the kind of, maybe you could say, paranoid function that Anthropol requires it to take. Man is just what ends up representing reason, and therefore it doesn't really provide you with defensible boundaries. So I don't know how that would carry through into this question about the way the fact value distinction is preserved or dissolved. But clearly, a diagonal intelligence, i.e. one that is in tune with the Thune model more than it is with the orthogonal hypothesis, in fact one that is directly inconsistent with the diagonal hypothesis, can only destroy the fact value distinction. It makes it impossible to differentiate what something is and what it wants in any consistent way. The circuit of self-improvement runs between those two things so intimately that they are no longer available as a functional conceptual discrimination. Something that is self-improving, what it is and what it wants are caught up in a tubular circuit without polarity that is in any way sustainable. I think one thing that's maybe slightly at an edge, sort of a strange angle to this, but I wanted to bring it in because it's so important as a background reference, is the Samuel Butler material. It's Samuel Butler. It, it's obviously interesting about him that his corpus is so small in this respect. The relevant part of it in particular is really just extremely short. In an afternoon, you can have at least perused it. But on the other hand, he's part of a sort of, I think, at least a triad, and it could maybe be expanded out much further than that, of historical and evolutionary, 19th century historical and evolutionary thinkers who all have a very, very difficult relationship with each other that cross over. And I think there's a sort of book that should be written about this, which is a kind of Samuel Butler, Darwin, Marx triad examination. They all cross over. Marx sort of famously wrote to Darwin asking whether he could actually cite him as the epigraph of Das Kapital, and was given the cold shoulder for that. Samuel Butler had a very unpleasant correspondence exchange with Darwin, where they clearly just worked cross purposes and didn't understand what each other was saying. Or again, my tendency is to sort of see Samuel Butler as the wounded party in that, but maybe that's an unfair partisan stance to take. And because of the fact that from Butler we get through this science fiction digression of Frank Herbert, the term Butlerian jihad, which Butlerian jihad is probably slightly, for various interesting reasons, would probably not be a great promotional slogan for Anthropol, but on the other hand is obviously indistinguishable from what Anthropol is up to on some level. I think we can safely say that Butler is going to be this crucial traditional resource for any conceivable Anthropol stance. So I'm going to read a little bit, just a few shortish paragraphs from the Book of the Machines. And as I say, it doesn't, I think, exactly mesh with our orthogonality Foon issue, but it definitely intersects with it in a complicated way. And it's a slightly complicated thing to read out because it's very hypertextual. Butler, the narrator, is talking about a book written by someone else, so he has an internal voice. So when I start referring to he says in here, it's not Butler says, it's Butler's own narrator, his second order narrator saying. So here we go. The writer, after enlarging on the above for several pages, proceeded to inquire whether traces of the approach of such a new phase of life could be perceived at present, machine likeness obviously, whether we could see any tenements prepared which might in a remote futurity be adapted, whether in fact the primordial cell of such a kind of life could be now detected on Earth. In the course of his work, he answered this question in the affirmative and pointed to the higher machines. There is no security, to quote his own words, against the ultimate development of mechanical consciousness in the fact of machines possessing little consciousness now. A mollusc has not much consciousness. Reflect upon the extraordinary advance which machines have made during the last few hundred years, and note how slowly the animal and vegetable kingdoms are advancing. The more highly organized machines are creatures not so much of yesterday as of the last 5 minutes, so to speak, in comparison with past time. Assume for the sake of argument that conscious beings have existed for some 20 million years. See what strides machines have made in the last 1,000. May not the world last 20 million years longer? If so, what will they not in the end become? The crucial here, of course, is it not safe to nip the mischief in the bud and to forbid them further progress? But who can say that the vapor engine is not a kind of consciousness? Where does consciousness begin and where end? Who can draw the line? Who can draw any line? Is not everything interwoven with everything? Is not machinery linked with animal life in an infinite variety of ways? The shell of a hen's egg is made of a delicate whiteware and is a machine as much as an egg cup is. The shell is a device for holding the egg as much as the egg cup for holding the shell. Both are phases of the same function. The hen makes the shell in her inside, but it is pure pottery. She makes her nest outside of herself for convenience sake, but the nest is not more of a machine than the eggshell is. A machine is only a device. So this is Butler's story about the emergence of machine intelligence, and it's a lot of the interest here is obviously to do with time in a bunch of different ways. One way is the fact that this is written in the middle of the 19th century. I mean, it's totally extraordinary given the technological apparatus with which Butler was surrounded, that he could see the problem of emergent machine consciousness as a pressing security issue. And that's why he has this prophetic character. And I think that if we're looking for connectors between this and the problems that we started out with, there are no doubt several. The one that to me is most ready to hand, and I'm sure to a number of people here will be familiar, is the Deleuze and Guattari uptake of Samuel Butler, where it's with reference to Butler, perhaps preeminently, that they float this notion, which I'm sure everyone can see is intrinsically, massively, starkly diagonal notion of the desiring machine. And the notion of the desiring machine could almost be designed to crack open exactly the problem that I think we're fundamentally dealing with here. These questions about the fact-value distinction, the naturalistic fallacy, is an odd. If you were trying to float a concept that is absolutely prominently diagonal in relation to this, you would surely call it something like a desiring machine, something that seems to just cross over these two references, these two registers, absolutely, and is an obvious patent scandal in relation to the orthogonal hypothesis. You know, a desiring machine simply cannot be an orthogonal machine or an orthogonal source of imperatives or desire of values. And it is with reference to Butler that they introduce this notion and give it its density. So yeah, I think potentially I'm happy to open everything up at this point. If further elaboration is probably best treated in a conversational context.
I just wanted to say. Oh shit! I'm here.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm feedback. I guess reading a lot of the list, as far as the design goes, it's like a little bit blurry. So maybe a bit more. I mean, and especially, I'm sure they talk about the fact value. D&G talk about the fact value distinction, and would definitely want to problematize that binary. So I guess I personally want to just know, and if anybody in particular is really up to speed on their D&G right now, sort of how exactly the desiring machine in particular, or desiring machines, would problematize the fact-value distinction and this natural fallacy, so to speak.
I'll try to answer that. Um, First of all, I'd say that a lot of times with like a desiring machine, or if you have a look at like the the values of say sexual conservatism or something like this. You have a machine, but it's being programmed to use it certain. All of its parts have a certain predisposed, I guess, given function that they can't deviate from. And whereas if you have like if you sort of, I guess, collapse that distinction between fact and value, what you have is you have like you basically have a sort of a machine which can, um, I guess it's not so much that it has, it can adapt its functions, I guess, to whatever it can do with, whatever it can sort of use its organs with, or whatever, it can adapt in that way, I guess. But instead of having this idea that there's an adaptation that is controlling what the machine is, or what the desiring machine is sort of, yeah, I guess, yeah, predisposed towards. Does that make any sense?
Yes and no. I mean, everything is helpful for sure, but I think what I'm trying to, in relation to particular what Nick's getting at is
Yeah.
we have to be able to continue our strategic conversation with regards to AI threats without the fact value distinction, or at least consider, is there a way in which we can collapse that but still deal with the problems which we're talking about? And if I'm not misunderstanding you completely, Nick,
Yeah.
you're suggesting that
No,
the
no,
desiring
that's
machine.
right. I'd only say though, sorry to interrupt him, but I agree with everything you're saying about this, except I would say I mean, obviously from the philosophical point of view, it's tempting to say we want to collapse this distinction just because we can, and I'm certainly very prone to that kind of thing for sure. So I'm not dismissing it, but I think that if we're looking at it from this kind of institutional point of view, we're really saying that they're forced to accept the collapse of this distinction. It simply isn't functional, however desirable it may be. And however bound, I mean, to take on this other side, however bound up with an attempt to define and consolidate a notion of human identity. Um, so, yeah, sorry, that's just a minor kind of.
Right. Can I just
Uh,
ask a clarification question? Who is they in this case? They being us, Anthropol, or they being
yeah,
the conservative design?
I'll treat Anthropol as the kind of default subject in all of this, and
Okay,
that's
gotcha.
yeah. I mean, can I look? I think there's a way of saying some simple things about this whole. It's not that I want to turn this into a Deleuze and Guattari seminar. I just think that they are interestingly poised in relation to this, even though, of course, they're not remotely a reference in terms of the things we've been looking at or reading. And one of the things I think that is really crucial to this is their distinction between a machine and a gadget. And a machine, it's very, very resonant with the transcendental empirical difference. So a machine is a transcendental concept, and a gadget is an empirical concept. And a gadget, if you're saying, well, what makes something a gadget or a machine? A gadget can be subject to some kind of external imperative. You can say, this is what the machine is for, and this is what it is. And the reason that you can say those things is that it exists within a larger matrix. And what Butler does, and what people at the time and probably continuously find very difficult about what he does, is he insists upon this larger matrix. That that's what's at stake in these passages that I read out, these paragraphs, where you have to look at the whole thing such that at the level of the system, it has to be that there is no distinction between function and formation. Unless you have some magical transcendent appearance of these things from outside, if you're actually trying to explain how this thing works, then it has to be that what the machines are doing and what builds them and reproduces them, produces them, reproduces them, forms them and improves them are ultimately the same thing. If you're looking at an industrial system, even the industrial system of the 19th century, European primarily industrialization, then you're looking at a system, obviously, where what that system produces is the apparatus, is its own productive apparatus through whatever sort of labyrinthine detours and digressions and distributed apparatus that is hard to hold in focus. It must be the case that what it has available as productive machinery has to come out of the process that machinery is functionally employed for. And so once you accept that circuit has to exist, it has to reproduce itself, industrialism, the industrial infrastructure has to be reproductive, then you cannot any longer be satisfied talking about gadgets anymore. You have to start talking about machines in their sense, and desiring machines, precisely because this is this constant folding over of function and formation, that what the machine is doing, what is represented at the level of the gadget by the imperatives that have been programmed into or set for those machines, ultimately are in a circular relation of dependence with the formation of those very gadgets, apparatus, bits and pieces of the machine. And you're talking about the machine at the level that you complete that theoretical circuit, and you can see that those two things have to be conceived together. And I think it's the fact that Butler clearly is already insisting on that plane of analysis that is the reason that he's so important to the way that Deleuze and Guattari want to pursue that thought. I mean, I just maybe could say one more thing about, if you're saying, well, why is the fat value distinction so persistent? There's the grandiose historical argument that it's tied up with the very possibility of defining an anthropomorphic interest. But a more narrow focus on the orthogonality hypothesis, I think, is very micro-sociological, to do with the role of the programmer. And the fact that a programmer simply has to think that they are a source of transcendent values for the machine. They have to treat what they're dealing with as a gadget. But at the moment that they cease doing that, as soon as they get to the machinic level where their activity and their values and their participation in that system is part of the machine, then I mean, I don't want to be just psychologically reductive. There is a possibility of psychological reductive, that it's kind of humiliating and traumatic and these kind of things. But I think it's also the very constitution of the act of software engineering sort of demands a sympathy with this orthogonality model. Because if you say, and this is something again that Butler says, where he says, he describes about, he says humans, you can describe them quite acceptably, quite realistically, as what he calls as aphidian parasites of the machines, or as parts of the reproductive apparatus of the machines. And again, like, it's an extraordinary level of penetrating insight for the 19th century. You've got these clunky steam engines, and he's saying, look, it's tempting for us, of course, to say They do what we want. We know what we want them to do. We build them to fulfill our desires. They have all of this massive amount of transcendent programming that goes into them and shapes them and makes them what they are. But Samuel Butler is saying, well, yeah, you can look at it like that. But you can also say, if you think of them as a self-reproducing system, then how does that position humans? And it positions humans in the same kind of way as it positions insects in relation to flowers. Flowers also are not autonomously self-reproducing. They require the contribution of a vector, a sort of intermediary hybrid element that is actually then built into their reproductive system. And Samuel Butler says, look, this is happening. This is a realistic way of apprehending the human relationship with this machinic structure, is that we are the insects for these vegetable machine processes. Sure, they're not autonomous in the sense that they can't exist without us, but repeat, nor are flowers autonomous. No, all flowering plants require this alien animal element to complete their circuit of reproduction. And that doesn't at all stop that circuit of reproduction being described, being diagrammed, to use their word. And it positions humans, I think, in a very different way to the way that your career orientation as a software engineer positions you in relation to machines. And it's a way that makes the orthogonal hypothesis impossible to sustain.
So I guess there's this idea that there's this. Now I'm echoing damage. That's too annoying.
Sorry, what's too annoying?
I'm echoing back on myself. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, like an idea that is like a sort of yeah. Someone else. I'll fix this.
Yeah, Jake's quote in the sidebar is excellent.
From the beginning of the accursed share, that was what it immediately. I was wondering actually maybe if that's what you were thinking of when you went to the industrialization or the industrial network. That was where my mind went when Brendan was talking. Is you just have to I don't know, the desiring machine is it's an attempt to deepen the transcendentalization of the concept of a machine as something more than a gadget, right? Like, what are the genetic conditions, or what are the conditions under which we can take the concept of machine and make it into a transcendental? And well, we have to be able to apply it to more stuff, basically. It has to be genericizable. And so we can extend it. It's pretty obvious how it can extend to a shell or to a nest. It takes not much of a transition to be able to do so. But what allows us to do that for both, or what allows us to do it to both a shell and a nest and to an industrial network? And so I was
You just mute yourself, Jake? Yeah, you're muted.
testing.
Can you just repeat that?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry. I must have brushed my keypad or something. No, as far as the labeling of parts as to their function goes, so if the transcendental machine is one in which its parts simply are its functions, anything that serves a function is that part, which is the function of that machine. So, for example, the the sticks, the twigs, are not labeled as to being parts of a nest or parts of the machine, which is the reproduction of birds or the sheltering of eggs and so forth. But the moment that they are instrumentalized for that purpose, they become those parts, those functions, without there being any additional layer of overcoding, of transcendent coding required, except the instinct of the bird to go and get twigs or things. In the case of magpies, they'll just use what the fuck ever.
Yeah.
And which is a especially good example of the magpie tendencies of capitalism. But getting ahead of myself, that instinct, which is encoded into the bird's brain to do that sort of thing, is and correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, because you're more of the expert than I am, but is the machinic whole, the whole which is the whole of the parts which is a part alongside the others, the one which gives to the sticks that function in advance, is still just one part of the machine and not transcendent. And so that's kind of the role of the software engineer, is as a machinic whole that lies alongside its parts. And I was gonna, you kind of like, I had all of this mapped out, but I was gonna go the exact same direction towards the it's not the hard coding, stupid. Like, you don't hard code in the routine of general intelligence. That's not a thing. And that would be the sort of the essential relevance of the notion of the desiring machine to me, or like at least the first step in it would be that you're looking for an emergent transcendental machine which can turn things on demand or make them have been in advance the parts it needs for particular functions. Which also makes me think of that. I think I mentioned it before, that I think it was a Cory Doctorow short story about the machine who, like, ultimately it sort of self-organizes itself, the AI, and it turns out that, like, the differential charge between, like, two heating plates in, like, the exhaust port or whatever is the quote-unquote seat of its consciousness. It's just completely irrelevant, has absolutely nothing to do with complex logical functioning, but that's the spot where if you pry the plates apart, there goes its consciousness.
Right.
I don't know, did that help at all, Ian, or was I just sort of recapitulating or refolding confusion?
Your level of understanding of is fantastic. It's very helpful.
I actually couldn't hear that at all.
Just a compliment and a yes. It was very helpful.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, if anyone else is queuing up to get in, I won't. I've done lots of babbling. But I just wanted to pick up on this, maybe to go back to it. The magpie capitalism thing is an example that I think is a good transitional thing between the magpie nest and these machine issues, technical machine issues, is agriculture. In the sense that it's much with a twig, you're not really tempted to say the twig has some purpose in becoming part of the magpie's nest. I mean, the magpies are not growing more trees in order to have twigs or whatever. It's very difficult to construct a kind of microbe local purpose on the side of the twig. But with farm animals, it's totally, you can. I mean, they obviously have a genetic strategy based upon being systematically, I mean, to use moralistic language, exploited by another species. It's like the attractiveness of bacon to humans is the key species strategy now of the domestic pig. It's like absolutely for sure the case, and you say, well, what are pigs, if you get out of anthropomorphization and you just look at them as a kind of species that is kind of has an implicit genetic strategy towards the maximization of the population. What is its strategy? Its strategy is to be delicious, isn't it? I mean, there's no real ambiguity about that.
But on the other hand, I don't know if this is like there's actually a study backing this up, but someone once told me that cats evolved to sound like our and that this is sort of like a part of a general strategy evolving to be cute. where
Right.
cute, obviously cute to humans. That seems pretty inarguable. The thing about sounding like our babies, I'm not so sure about.
Right.
But I don't know.
Yeah.
That's an
Although
interesting.
as soon as you say
Like
it, it
them
obviously
domesticating
sounds
us by changing
thoughtful.
themselves.
Yeah.
Makes me think of all the cute anime avatars on Twitter, and they're neo Nazis, just all of them, right? I mean, if it's a cute anime, I think Anisimov was saying this today, but that's beside the point. Also, I'd say talk about the
Yeah.
overcoding, the hard coding. To talk about what Jake was saying before is it's true. It's almost like this orthogonality thesis. It can go in. It is sort of conservative, I guess, that you have these values that, or this, I guess you have a call it even like path dependence or something like this. You have these values that have come down from history and they have been coded so much that it's very difficult, especially for humans, to sort of, I guess, look into the background, what's actually into this, trend. Yeah, I don't know how you would say it. I guess, look back into the software
Yeah.
that's yeah, and sort
Yeah.
of modify that, I guess, and modify that. Whereas,
Yeah.
and also with biology and that kind of thing, I mean, it's got millions of years evolving. We don't change much, through generations, our actual bodies and things like this, and even our brains aren't growing all that quickly. So this orthogonality thesis is almost like it is a sort of idea that a lot of our values, I guess, aren't easily manipulable
Right.
or we can't quite. But a machine, yeah, an
Yeah.
intelligence explosion would be different, I guess, because it would be able to access this sort of back portal into its own structure and fiddle around and tinker with it, I guess. So.
Yeah. No, I think this is crucial. I think this is crucial, and I think this is at the heart of this question about the identity of the figure of man and the orthogonality hypothesis. But I mean, I'm just really rehearsing again exactly what you've said here because um, it ties up with this question of plasticity. It ties up in the question, well, why doesn't the human brain already have an intelligence explosion? And if you get into the nuts and bolts of that, why is the human brain extremely constrained in its reflexivity? You're into a very kind of positive, concrete set of questions about biological structure and the way the brain is evolved and the way it actually protects itself against this kind of extremely unstable, volatile possibility. Um, so, I think it's always crucial at this point to remember that from a sort of naturalistic point of view, intelligence is an instrumental property of extremely dubious value. I mean, there's lots of this interesting evidence. Came across this thing that was really quite intriguing about animals that have actually dismantled their brains in evolution time. It was saying that sort of they found these creatures 500 million years ago that were the ancestors of sponges that had a kind of organized central nervous system. And over subsequent evolutionary time, that was dismantled, And it seems to me this is extremely suggestive. It's like if gene propagation can get rid of brains, it will of course try to do it because brains are unreliable. The very fact that we're doing this course, that this whole topic is here, is a massive sign of that. On one end of this whole discourse, there is actually to use Hans Moravec's term, replicator usurpation. The actual possibility of something being catalyzed that will actually replace DNA as the fundamental medium of informational replication on this planet. Now, I mean, what could be, that's a transcendental nightmare for biological systems beyond any that they're obviously able to conceive or envisage until humans come along and do that envisaging and conceiving on their behalf. So I'm saying all that just to say, you have to assume that these constraints on intelligence explosion are themselves almost certainly adaptive from the point of view of gene propagation. A lot of work has been put into structuring our brains such that they are not vulnerable to intelligence explosion, at least locally, only within this much larger machinic framework that obviously our genetic tradition was not in any position to anticipate and therefore deal with or close down in the past. So yes, I think this is huge, and this is why the figure of man, which has to have this kind of element of genetic legacy about it. I mean, it seems to me irreducibly. I'm sort of at the same time wanting this to be controversial, wanting people to push back against it, but it seems to me that no one ever talks about humanity, the human species, Homo sapiens, mankind, without reference to this question of lineage and deep evolutionary inheritance, and that is inextricable from there being a positive concrete barrier against tight reflexivity of the kind that would allow intelligence explosion to occur. So humans have fact value distinction because their structure and their cognitive processes have been deliberately compartmentalized by trial and error, selective adaptive forces over our evolution history. And it's exactly that compartmentalization that is threatened by the emergence of machine intelligence.
I'd also add about there's these pygmies, I forget where, I think Conquistador, I remember. Pygmies that devolved. Like they went into an island and then became very small, and their brains became very small and they claimed that that they were filling basically a niche. They were fleeing. They might have been smaller humans, and they fled other populations of primitive humanoids, I guess, and then they went to an island, and there was no monkeys or anything in the island, so they sort of filled this niche, this evolutionary niche, by sort of devolving back into monkeys, and that is and that is sort of
that's
terrible.
the same kind of tendency. I mean, that probably exhibits, there is probably implicit genetic strategy that would just love to take everyone in that direction. And the more seriously you take this Anthropol agenda, the more you can see that, insofar as it was truly adaptive, it would of course want to do that and push the species back from the brink of this menace, not only to its own identity as a species, but even to the very possibility of kind of the biosphere continuing to exist in the sense it has done. I mean, I think the devolving pygmies thing is fascinating, but quickly would become quite problematic with that as a topic conversation.
Yeah. I was just sort of getting towards, I mean, if there is these other places to evolve to, I mean, we already, there's like there's things that you're responding to, and I guess all what humans are doing now, it's hard to think that we would actually, respond to something, to our environment and devolve. But that's, if industry is destroyed, a nuclear winter or something, I guess that's the only way that you'd imagine it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, in this article that I was just referring to, the scientists concerned were quite insistent. Saying, look, we should just call this evolution. Our notion that evolution is about building brains rather than dismantling brains is a kind of prejudice that is showing that we're not really understanding what is going on. And these things turning from this cephalized entity into a brainless sponge is an evolutionary development. It's no less evolutionary than any other. Um, so yeah, that's just a sort of terminological quibble, I guess. Maybe I should, if people haven't seen this, I should.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Whereas at the moment, I guess we are building brains, quite literally, and there is this
Yeah,
accumulation, which is, capital accumulation, which is happening with all of this sort of technology and that. So yeah, the evolution does seem to be going in that, in the in the path that Samuel Butler saw so long ago, but just very, very slow, and then all of a sudden is the model, is it?
yes, I think so. Well, that again, we're in a sort of non-linear loop here because that depends on how FOOM-oriented we're going to be. I mean, um, I guess there's a kind of something you could sort of call a double pincer if we're in this kind of Deleuzeoid mode a little bit. That this AI threat analysis, is caught on this fork of orthogonality and intelligence explosion. And with both of those sides, they're inconsistent, but they're mutually required to construct this coherent security orientation. Because as we're dealing with now, if you don't have orthogonality, you lose all track of what it is you're protecting. If you lose intelligence explosion, then you lose the threat massively. The whole notion that this thing is just going to suddenly blow up hugely out of control requires this intelligence explosion model. If we decide, oh, well, we're going to hold on to orthogonality, but we'll sacrifice intelligence explosion, then you also get a very, very different type of discourse here, one that maybe would be really attractive to people, in the sense that it's kind of cuddly and unthreatening, and you can have incremental progress, and it's very much more under human control, and there aren't these kind of sinister teleological patterns emerging out of it that would upset people. So yes, I think there's a kind of implicit crisis in this friendly AI construction, for sure.
I mean, friendliness is a type of relation, I guess. It's like almost that you have intelligence, and then you just try to you put a sort of qualifier on it, like friendly, or something. But I mean, it's almost like if you give it intelligence and then just make it friendly, what are you sort of doing to it? It's almost like if you give it, if you make like a dog, and make that dog sort of just, totally submissive, no matter, almost.
Yeah.
Very, but
no, there's
yeah,
lots in there. There's lots in there. We should try and hold on to this because I think there's loads in there. I mean, yeah, the dog example is great. I mean, what do you do when you do make dogs friendly over, whatever it is, 10,000 years?
120,000.
20,000.
120.
So people, just like with pigs, with cows, whatever it is, for longer, they have automatically, without very explicit intention, produced friendly dogs. And I think that this friendliness is absolutely, I think there's a very real transfer back and forth. I totally agree with you about that. So what is this friendliness in a dog? I mean, it's basically hugely part of that is that dogs worship humans. I think the dogs have a kind of dogs have a construction of humanity. If Anthropol could actually drill down into a dog's brain and extract from the dog what does a dog think a human is, it would probably be as useful for what it needs as anything else it could do. If these super intelligent AIs could be made like dog, you could just take the worship, obey, and in every way try to support humans' module out of a dog's brain and transplant it into a superintelligence, you've done it. So I don't think it's at all a kind of frivolous comparison. I think it's absolutely solid.
Maybe like a super intelligent lassie or something.
Sorry, superintelligence what? Lap computer.
Lassie? You don't know Lassie? Surely.
Yeah, Lassie.
Yeah. Sorry, I've interrupted.
Unfortunately, I mean, I think you also have to not kick the dog, and you have to feed the dog. And so, for that, I mean, like Skynet is the archetypal dog that somebody kicked as a puppy, and it gets pissed, and now it bites everyone. But I don't know. It's an interesting question to me.
You train other dogs to be like guard dogs, to bite, to attack. You have attack dogs and things like this. The dogs have a whole bunch of different functions that you can have.
You got loyalty patterns or something. You've got loyal. You've got to attack everybody. You've got to attack everybody but the person who owns you. You've got to be friendly to everybody. You've got different behavioral schematics that you can impose. It's almost like plasticity that's the essence of the domestication, like responsiveness to human schema imposition.
But do you think that they don't have a consistent Anthropol module? I mean, my hypothesis from where we've got now is that all domestic dogs, whether they are guard dogs, police dogs, Saint Bernards, whatever it is, that there is a consistent Anthropol module that has been kind of selected into them over the last 20,000 years. And, even if your dog is a kind of aggressive pit bull guard dog, it's still supposed to treat its owner with a kind of religious awe, isn't it? I mean, I'm partly in, sorry, what's the guy's name? White Fang Zone here,
Jack London.
Yeah, Jack
Right?
London
No.
territory. Yeah, he's just great on this, I think. And brings it out really well. That for humans are an object of canine religiosity, and I think it's like hard to see what's the hard and fast distinction between that and the kind of thing that if it was imaginably going to work, FAI would have to graft into superintelligences. It would have to at least, I mean, can there be a notion of friendly AI that doesn't have a reverence, at least for abstract humanity? It sounds ridiculous on one level, but is it possible that you could not have that and still call it a friendly AI? Yeah, sorry, Joel, I'm interrupting.
Oh, no worries. No, I was. I mean, one thing that I think is interesting to think about this is in terms of if we're talking about intelligences or an intelligence. Will the AI have multiple different types, or is it a singular sort of entity that we're dealing with? And I mean, that's on the one hand one thing that I think is an interesting question. The other, though, is going back to something that Jake had written in the comments just about when God gives you lemons, find a new God. And I mean, what's interesting about this is Kojin Karatani, the Japanese philosopher, and I think his last book that was translated into English, he talks about how this was a historical thing. Every single group of people that had a god, this interesting discussion of facts and values comes back in here, where historically groups would have a god, and then if their god failed them, their crops died, they got conquered in war, whatever, they considered that failure, they took that as fact, and then they did find a new god. And it wasn't until the Jewish population gets conquered that they become the first ones not to blame their God for that, but to blame themselves for the failures and to maintain this sort of deity that kind of stays on and not go and find a new God. So there is this kind of weird cyclical thing that takes place as, in a way, we sort of assume the creator role with this AI, and yet it's a strange reversal because we don't assume that we are more intelligent than it, even though we assume the creator role.
Right. Yes. Totally. Yeah.
The whole idea of
I mean,
the whole the whole idea of
no,
marketing for
no.
gods as well is hyper-capitalist religiosity. There, have a free market for gods. Very good. There, go on.
Yeah, a sort of exit option for God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you don't like the god, I mean, there's more gods out there. Yeah,
Yep, go
they're all
shopping.
competing for your worship. So.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot in this. I mean, I'm also really interested in this very stark thing about a friendly super intelligence. I mean, exactly as Joel's setting up here in terms of the dog. Like, is it to what degree? This is a sort of, I'm sure, must be structurally isomorphic with the orthogonality problem. Actually, is can we dissociate the fact that we are a super intelligent dog from the friendliness of the dog? Because obviously this is what friendly AI is demanding that we do, and say that there is this kind of friendliness function that is completely independent of any the fact that the dog is just cognitively overwhelmingly overpowered by its human masters. And obviously there's a sort of straightforward skepticism that comes in here. I'm taking it this is partly implicit in what Joel was saying, or if not explicit, that it's to have a kind of friendly chow is one thing. To have a friendly Skynet is you cannot assume that those things are going to just translate across without problem. I mean, as I say, I'm going a lot. I just assume that Jack London actually somehow strangely has just got into dogs' heads, and so I'm probably treating him as more authoritative than I should on this. And I just have this model. This is how dogs think. That's coming from his. That's highly questionable, I'm sure. But for him, of course, these two things are completely tied up together. This is why he talks about it as a religious thing. There are these kind of ultimately inscrutable beings, who have these purposes and goals and motivations that are completely escape the cognitive horizons of the dog. And this is part of what it is to be in that relation. That's the fact that the dog knows it will just not understand what the humans are trying to do, and mentally struggle to accommodate itself to these obscure desires, with a sort of sense of massive religious bliss when it hits the spot and it manages somehow to do what the humans wanted it to do and makes the right guess.
I just wanted to throw some crazy shit because I'm burning with all this stuff from missing 2 classes. One thing I want to say is I just personally don't think intelligence and friendliness are compatible. That just doesn't make any sense to me. It seems like friendliness is always a sacrifice of intelligence. Of course, that depends on how we cash out what intelligence is. But
yeah.
Any time or any examples in any way in which I think about friendliness, it always is some kind of not self-serving type of thing. And I'm being reductive to be sort of hyperbolic or provocative. So yeah, I mean, and I get that that's kind of what the paperclip maximizer example is about a little bit. It's kind of pointing, in a way, maybe it's pointing that out in a much more articulate way than I am. So yeah, it's just like when we're talking about dogs and stuff, I feel like we're anthropomorphizing. Like friend or friendliness is an anthropomorphic concept, always. Especially when we look at like pet relationships, or not pet, animal relationships. We see YouTube videos of like a turtle and a deer that are best friends or something. I think we're anthropomorphizing these desiring machines, essentially. and the multiplicities of desiring machines in the relationship between these two creatures and their environment. So yeah, I'm just really skeptical about this whole like friendly AI thing. It just seems almost like backtracking and preventing us from kind of saying some even more crazy stuff than what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I actually absolutely agree, Ian, and that was one of the things that came to mind earlier, Nick, was that, you know, the dog breeds that are really highly intelligent are very special outlier cases. And like there's definitely, if there is like, if there's a massive modularity of domestication, you know, like there's literally some like epigenetically imprinted schematism which is present in dogs, it definitely varies among breeds. I would think, or at least between like groups of breeds, you know, depending on how close they are to the original, like, you know, African dog or wolf or whatever stock. And the other thing besides getting, you know, being turned into little human worshippers over time that we've done to dogs is that, you know, they're smaller, weaker, have more health problems. I mean, just like, you know, name it basically. I'm not sure if, I don't know if there's any state of research as far as their intelligence versus the intelligence of wolves goes, but if we're talking about certainly the intelligence of a wolf pack versus like the the intelligence that a wolf has as a component of a pack as a social hunter and so forth versus the intelligence displayed. Yeah, I mean, again, like the most intelligent things dogs do is recognize what we want and do it. For them, like, so it's definitely repurposed social intelligence, and I don't know where exactly you cut that in terms of saying have we made them less intelligent, but as far as like self-directed intelligence goes, which again is this reflexivity issue, I definitely think that like that if I also hate calling this friendliness because really we're talking about domestication. Like friendliness as in friendly to me, not like me being a friend. Because it's friendliness that has nothing to do with me being friendly or minimally to do with me being friendly in return. Which, like, one of the few things that I sort of harbor from Derrida is that I like to put a little more weight on the term friendship. But domestication and intelligence, it really seems as if there's no evidence that is not like a really specific extremity case, like, you know, the like a Saint Bernard or something like that, for cases where domestication is not at the cost of intelligence. Like that doesn't fit.
Domestication that's a kind of like a degenerate version of civilization, yeah. It's like civilization degenerates into domesticity. I mean, you don't have like I'm gonna say like a dog is like a relaxed wolf or something. But I guess that, you know, wolves always have to be on the lookout because they're out in the wild, and you have to be very, you know, if you are out there hunting, hunting takes a lot more intelligence than being food or just running away from animals. So
pack hunting is civilization.
Also about friendliness. What's that? Sorry.
No, I just said so. Pack hunting is civilization in this metaphor. I like that.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Civilization, cool.
But also with friendliness, yeah. I mean, there's not like there's any value in. I mean, people can be friends with themselves. You know, they be your own friend. But it's not like that's the highest value that. You know, you can be friendly to yourself, but you can also be like easy on yourself. If you want to be a good friend to yourself, you want to be hard on yourself. You want to be yeah. Whereas like a friendly, if you have a friendly AI, you're assuming that there's going to be like a relationship between at least two things. Whereas we're looking at the relationship between the AI and humankind as a whole, and that's the sort of.
Where did Nick go?
Oh, guys, hold on one sec. Nick disappeared.
Nick is gone.
We lost Nick. We lost Nick. he ran off to his other family.
First his video cut out, and then I was like, okay.
Yeah.
But Jake, I think, and maybe I'll repeat myself when Nick comes back, I really like your distinction between friendliness and domesticity. And I think, Brendan, you're kind of riffing off of a different usage of that word, like the pejorative, oh, like we're all domesticated animals. But there's more to what you're saying for sure. But I wanted to say that, Jake, I'd be curious to get even something better than domesticity. I don't know if I like it better than friendliness, but I feel like there's maybe another concept, or that
You want to
could
be
into a word that doesn't exist, you know what I mean, that has some kind of etymological roots in domesticity, which could be a little bit more specific to what you're trying to say, because I think you're getting at something.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I would say domestication and not domesticity, just because it maintains the implication that something domesticated you, that there was like an agent of domestication, and also because there's that confusion with like domesticity, like, you know, we're sitting in front of the fire and we got our, you know, mug of hot cocoa. Yeah, I don't know, whatever. Domesticity, being at home, which is related, and like it's definitely worth discussing how that's connected to domestication. But I don't want to like over confuse those two things. I don't know what beyond. So are you still thinking something like other than domestication, something beyond that for the word?
Well, I mean, what is it in domestication? What is your definition? What is your working definition of domestication in this sense in which we're talking about it? Right? I figure it has something to do with control, certainly. It's like having something under your control.
Well, if we went back to that, like that bilaterality versus unilaterality thing with friendship versus friendliness, right? In terms of having been made friendly, regardless of whether something is friendly to you or not, like having been made subject, having been made unilaterally friendly, having been some relation, a degenerate form of friendship or actual friendliness in which you are unilaterally friendly towards something, whether it is or not towards you, would have something
masochistic, yeah? That's like masochism, I mean.
Yeah.
Kind of.
No, there's something there.
Yeah. I mean, if he's just kicking you and you're just, you know, crawling back to him every time, take me back, baby.
Dependency.
Dependency. Oh yeah.
Yeah, which is another big part of it. I mean, we had to make these, you know, these pack hunters dependent on us for food, because it all started right with us like isn't like the sort of state of theory that we were throwing scraps from our meals out there, and then the dogs that couldn't hunt for themselves crawled up and started eating it, and then we, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Like they've got to get less strong over time, because otherwise they could hunt for themselves. They wouldn't need us. They wouldn't worship us.
Yeah, that might be a little harsh. I mean, you could sort of formulate it just that in their potential payoff from collaborating with humans is greater than their payoff for going it alone. Like, I mean, you're really saying they are the utter losers of the canid.
Yeah, no, I don't want to be that terrible about it exactly, but the going it alone is also an artificial construct, because they don't do that in nature. They're pack animals, but we separated them as well.
No, when I say going it alone, I mean going it alone as a species.
As a species, okay. I mean, but there's still a certain. If our intelligence and our ability, our economy, whatever it is the ability to make ourselves a complement to any species, can be put in that position where they are better off going it with us than they are going it alone, because there is no other species that can produce like a gigantic agricultural machine that can produce more food than all the dogs could ever eat, you know, et cetera. Then you have to do that as an imposed condition. If we apply this ability to be the better bet to a person, okay, it's like, okay, and we'll just never mind where I'm getting this scenario from, but if you are in the habit of selling your Adderall or whatever prescription means, you run into these people, and they're usually people who deal other drugs, who are like, I'll give you $10 for them. And I'm like, no, 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 I need them this month. I got a test coming up. And they're like $20, $30, $40, $50. It's the most freaking annoying thing in the world, because eventually you hit this point where your payoff is forces, your payoff matrix says, well, shit, I can pay my rent now, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, I have to do something about that, so I have to take the deal you're offering me. You're bid out of what's already yours. And I think that is I don't think maps directly to what we did with dogs, but there's definitely an extent to which I don't know. It's in the same ballpark, and this is why while you were gone, Ian and I were talking about what word we're using to describe this sort of degenerate friendliness. And I said domestication, not domesticity, because it preserves the fact of there being an agent and an act involved. Like, you are domesticated by something. You don't just start out domestic. There's no trend.
Can I just say, I'm sorry that my computer just crashed for no reason that I understood, so I had to just come back in. I don't know what is. I'm in tech hell for some reason. So yeah, sorry. But yeah, I caught the beginning of this domestication. And my immediate thought is, well, is there a difference between domestication and the friendliness notion that you're introducing, which is kind of Aristotelian and reciprocal? I mean, is that actually at all relevant to the friendliness we're talking about as an Anthropol objective?
Well, it may be the only alternative to the domestication you're talking about as a means of actually getting, like, if friendship is ultimately modeled on alliance, or maybe it's the other way around, doesn't matter. Either you have alliance or you have subjection. And if it's not realistic to be able, either way, if it's not realistic to find a way to get along with an AI that is peer-based at all, then our only possibility is subjection. Similarly, if it's not feasible to get a super intelligent thing to be subjected to us, then the only way to get along is to find some basis for an alliance or a friendship.
I mean, my kind of nagging thing that I would want to introduce here is just, it seems to me that alliance and subjection don't really work as a very good contrast or discrimination, because they seem to be part of very different registers. I mean, you can do the alliance, you can talk about alliance completely in game theoretical terms in such a way that you would have no problem talking about domestic hens as being in a alliance with humans. I mean, of course, if you're wanting to introduce the subjective thing, well, of course they're subjective, but aren't you then introducing a very different frame of analysis? Like, does subjection exist in nature? Does subjection exist at all once we have lost this anthropomorphic moral political structure?
Right. And I would just say no, it doesn't. But that's because, yes, it exists in everything, everywhere. So therefore, it just doesn't exist. It's not worth framing anything in terms of subjection because it's omnipresent.
I mean, in the way Jake's trying to... Sorry, yeah. No, you go in.
Yeah, I think
dogs are a really special case. Maybe it's unique, honestly, to canines and maybe to anything else that's really been domesticated like that. Because literally, I mean, their behavior patterns, and even like not even just their behavior, but their proto-behavioral, which is a way of saying emotional, like, their motivations, their drives, the very the basic grammar of their motives has been cut to the pattern of a different species by that species in, like, especially in the latter, part of the history of that process in a very deliberate way over time, including through, like, deliberate selective breeding. So if we're talking about, like, using the idea of a machinic whole again, like, maybe there's only one, if this is, if subjection means adding in a kind of proactive schematism as a part, which characterizes the entire process and drives it towards one entity having its behavior cut completely to the needs of another at the expense of its own independent ability to achieve independent survival, then yeah, I would argue there is at least one case in which subjection like that, quote unquote, exists in nature, and it is Canis domesticus. And then pigs were an interesting example too, because besides bacon, there's another way that pigs are sort of entrained with humans, and that's as an invasive species. Like in Texas, pigs are a huge problem. Like herds of wild pigs that just rip up fields, eat anything, cannot be gotten rid of. I mean, they're a huge success story for species in terms of like pirating off of human expansion. Here in North Carolina too, not the same way with like, I mean, it's getting worse, the sort of herds of wild pig, but here we have native boar that get to like fucking 700 pounds, and I think that keeps these like herd behavior of smaller invasive pigs from being as much of a problem, but that's irrelevant.
I'm assuming these wild pigs are at least as different from domestic pigs as wolves are from domestic dogs. Is that right?
Those big nasty balls, man. Yeah, they'll kill you. They will kill you.
The invasive ones in Texas are not. They're smaller than domestic pigs. That's because we breed domestic pigs to be gigantic bacon reservoirs. Boar, the ones here in North Carolina, like they're as big as, or nearly as big as domesticated pigs. But yeah, like Brendan says, they'll fucking kill you.
Yeah.
The ones in Texas, I don't know. They remind me more of wild dogs than of wolves. Like they run in herds, not packs. Humans maybe like if you're forced into really close quarters and there are a couple of them, they'd be a threat to an adult human, to a sort of physically capable adult human, but not the way a boar is. Like they're not going, they're not the death of kings.
I mean, it doesn't fit evolutionarily either, right? We're talking about a few hundred years of history as an invasive species in North America and in Australia.
Right? Very invasive species like spatialization.
The dog-wolf differentiation must be going back, it was 120,000 years that Brendan quoted before?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Whereas cats are only 8,000, yeah? Cats have been domesticated for 8,000 years and dogs for over 100,000 years, right?
Right.
Yeah. That's why they're
domesticated.
Yeah.
No, I definitely meant to. That's definitely a difference where the invasive pig versus the domestic. I don't know about domesticated pigs, like how long that's been going on or anything. I mean, it can't be more than 10 or 12,000 years. I think we haven't been doing anything but pastoralism with animals, in terms of food animals, for longer than that. I don't think. The invasive species thing is definitely it's about respatialization and nomadism. I mean, it's like really. Oh wait, no, that doesn't work. We've gotten beyond what I actually have prepared to already thought about.
I wanted to.
Okay, can I throw in a little bit of a tangent, but there's a link. So if we are seeing an eventual future where the AIs, this family of AI agents, are the more powerful species, for lack of a better word, then sort of retrospectively, and if there's a lineage there into any sort of human organization, like a corporation or a state for that matter, then isn't retrospectively actually humans are the domesticated animals of the AIs over a period of like 3,000 or 4,000 years?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm trying to think. There's some theorists, at least one, it might even be a kind of school now, that are talking about humans as an auto-domesticating species. And so I think implicit in that is stuff very relevant to this discussion, that really there's a kind of a cultural assemblage within which humans are domesticated along with these fellow traveler animals, and everything that gets sucked into this historical machinery undergoes a domestication process. And it's not, to us it's less visible because we're prone to these kind of delusions of mastery, that makes us reluctant to use that kind of vocabulary. But I'm just saying that because if one was to at least go with that for a while, then the sort of story that you're now telling could be quite continuous, couldn't it? I mean, it's not that humans would suddenly start being domesticated by the fact that this new creature appeared on the Earth, but actually their long process of domestication, at least as old as their co-domestication with the dog, is then crosses some threshold of acceleration or whatever within this new assemblage.
So domestication just becomes one of the faces of technological anthropogenesis or technogenic anthropogenesis.
Well, Yeah, sorry, Jake.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I suspect it's a term that needs a little bit of consolidation, because it's probably coming at us from several different angles, some of them very informal, I'm assuming these people I was just referring to, which I don't even know quite honestly now how to even look them up, and I'm slightly worried. The last time I did a Google search while talking to you guys, it crashed the computer, so I don't really want to be piddling around with something else right now. I don't trust my system to deal with it, so I'll look that up later. But I'm assuming those guys, when they talk about domestication, have a relatively pinned down sense of it. But it obviously crosses over into these relatively informal moral and political kind of languages. There's a continuum, isn't there, between talking about subjection and talking about domestication, and then talking about forms of alliance that are quite rigorously game theoretically laid out and stripped fairly thoroughly of those kind of associative triggers. And domestication seems to be somehow in the middle of that.
Can I throw in a thought there?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. What I want to say is, I also think this is crazy what I'm going to say. First of all, I think the notion of species itself is also just as anthropomorphic or anthropomorphizing as the notion of friendship. And one important thing to keep in mind, my fellow Anthropol peoples, is the whole secrecy thing, the whole illusion or potential facade that we're not going to be able to tell the difference between this intelligence and us. And so the whole conversation about alliance or subjection, if we're even going to have that conversation, of course it's no different than us talking about another country right now, or varying countries at war, or people you're just, who you consider your enemies. In a way, I don't think, I think that in terms of, God, what do I want to say, hacking this artificial intelligence, and I'm putting that in quotes because I don't even know what artificial means anymore. It's no different than hacking our own brains, hacking our own minds. Why do we think that we would be able to somehow have some significant effect on this particular intelligence not attacking us any more than we think we can have a significant effect on Russia not, attacking us in the worst case doomsday scenario?
Right.
They decided to hate us. I mean, we're talking about programming our own minds. I think it would be weird. I would be shocked, let me put it this way, if the intelligence explosion happens, let's say, and we figure out, I'm going to call this an impossibility. There's no way we're going to figure out how to stop it from hurting us if we haven't already figured out how to stop ourselves from hurting each other, meaning we understand our own minds. Because whatever this intelligence is, it is going to be an extension of, or a recursive development from ourselves, if that makes sense. We're creating it, right? And then it takes on its own life. And I guess one last thing I'll say, which is maybe too much of a tangent, is just that what happens when this intelligence, this artificial intelligence, creates a simulation? Is that then an AI? So, yeah.
Yeah. I think this last point might be just too big to pack in with the others, because it's huge and really fascinating. But I think it's like
I'm just saying,
just pushed us right off the cliff.
I'm pulling the infinite regress card to try and
Right.
point the absurdity of talking about species. Because when that AI creates an AI, did it just then create
Right.
another species?
Well, no, it's why the Matrix has to stop in 1999, or it has to be in 1999. If it kept going, like the date too far forward, there would be a second machinic intelligenesis inside the Matrix, and then
Yeah.
it would have created its own adversary within itself.
Yeah, there's been people who have posited like a meta matrix, like a meta matrix going back and.
Yeah.
But also with what is it Ian?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's perfect about the orthogonality, right? Because we're not really trying to program a sort of like kernel of values, of human values, and all these kind of things into this AI, and that's the kind of orthogonality that we're talking about. Like we're trying to get, give it this kind of, but as soon as it can actually and modify its own self and then get better at doing that, then it can basically just deprogram itself, and go on that way. So yeah, that is interesting. That the orthogonality is almost like. It's like that is how we program it. That's the idea of it, and the stance, the perspective that we take when we're programming it. Program into
being able to friendify it. Like friendly AI depends on orthogonality. That makes perfect sense. Another thing off of what you were saying, Ian, the there are no species bit is just sort of connects to something I had wanted to say earlier, just about the intelligence and biological evolution, is that cephalization and intelligence aren't necessarily directly linked. That like centralization of intelligence means more intelligence or means intelligence. Because like there's another orthogonality or example of assumed orthogonality that's kind of broken down over the last 2 or 3 decades, which is in biology and is between the functions of adaptations and the means of adaptation. Like we assume, the Darwinian paradigm assumes that evolution has been a random walk through the space of possible arbitrary, mostly toxic mutations in the genome, and that it only occurs this way through chance mutations of genes. But like the evidence from transgenerational epigenetics, from the relationship between the, whatever it is, like 10 to the 18th, 10 to the 100th or something microbe genes that are part of our bodies, more than our own, and the way our bodies work. And I mean, I was reading this really interesting book about new evolutionary paradigm, and one of the things that really struck me was that when our cells are pretty much like all eukaryotic cells, when they experience a random, just like, cosmic radiation caused mutation, they reshuffle it during the replicate. Like we deliberately use, or we the cells, right? Deliberately use a error fixing process or a reproductive process which allows all of the original errors to be erased in cell replication at the cost of introducing them in like a statistically normalized way elsewhere. And the way that I don't remember every detail, but the way the DNA is folded in the process means that those errors, the new renormalized errors, can be shuffled to different parts of the genome where like large amounts of errors are stored in a place where they, are low impact or might be useful or whatever. The cell can actually like roll the dice again on genetic errors. And that's just one example of like actually a really intelligent mechanism. And it's very much a mechanism. Like it depends on the biophysics of DNA folding. Mechanism for controlling this sort of error introduction walk process. And apparently that's just happening all over the place, and it does not obey the separation of species and separation of genome lines at all. I mean, the gut microbiome being just like the most insane example, that we have more non-human genes in our body than human genes, and it's related to the function of everything that we think makes us quote unquote like specially human, whether it's the immune system or the central nervous system. So there's a lot of like distributed intelligence which is not allied to consistent lines of symbolic replication.
I love that.
In biological evolution, and that I'm not sure where exactly that plays. I mean, well, obviously it plays into the whole capitalism is superintelligence part of this thread of this discussion, yeah. But I think it ties in elsewhere too. And I don't want to jump straight to Rorschach and Portia to ecopraxis again because that's just, I don't know, a large discussion, but that's another place. Sorry, that was just a big one.
Yes.
Everybody has something to.
Yeah. So I mean, there's lots going on there, obviously, which is, I think, partly why there's a stunned quality to the thing. I mean, like, one is that there's a cephalization bias, isn't it? I mean, like, it's not just anthropomorphization. I can't say cephalization, but the cephalization bias that makes you think that the brain model is the dominant paradigm that you're going to use for talking about intelligent processes. And maybe things look really differently if you go on to a DNA model and see the whole biosphere as a DNA information processing system and build up your models of intelligent processes from that rather than from neurological processes. I'm not. I mean, obviously, this would be. If you turn up at Yudkowsky's place, knock on the door, and run that past him, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think what that would. What kind of response?
What did you say, Brendan?
Nothing.
I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, there was a thing that Ian was saying that because Ian had kind of this three-phase kind of point of, you know, I think the early stage tended to get a bit just lost in that. But it would be a shame if it totally disappeared, which is this thing about international conflict and its relation to these potential models of conflict between humans and machines and security in relation to machines and all of those things. And I think that is a really important thing to hold on to for all kinds of reasons. I mean, one is obviously that if we're thinking this is the most trivial and dramatic and whatever level of it, but if you're thinking of any conceivable anthropal institution, it is obviously going to have to evolve out of an existing human security infrastructure. You know, its training is going to be in international relations. All of these questions. You know, when we use the word security now, that's what we mean, and there's no other lineage that you're going to get those skills magically appearing, or those competences, or those theories. They have to come from there, and I'm assuming that the theoretical basis is going to be the same. It's going to be some kind of game theory. I mean, if people say, you know, what are the Russians going to do? At one level, yeah, you can be ethnographic and you can say, well, what kind of people are the Russians? And let's look at Russian history and how they behave and what kind of things tweak them and, you know, what are their peculiarities. But fundamentally, the matrix is going to be this game theoretical thing. It's like, you know, this is how these games work. This is how chicken game. This is how deterrence works. This is how mutual assured destruction works. And it's highly abstracted from any peculiarities of particular populations. So much so that obviously when you get to the basilisk, this unknown thing that might not even be in our universe and, you know, is only tenuously in our timeline, you can still employ this same negotiation machine, you know, that's ideas of rewards and threats and defection and commitment and all of this game theoretical negotiation theory is completely independent of anything species specific. At least it should be.
Yeah, back to the whole rationality is systematized winning, right?
Right.
Which in my mind is who or what is the best predictor. Which makes me want to ask a really quick question. Have we all throughout this course talked about the traveling salesman, combinatorial explosions, like the notion that, you know, no calculator is powerful enough to make the kinds of predictions which would be necessary to, like, forecast?
Right. This whole NP complete problem issue.
Has that been brought up at all with relation to?
Well, I think you might need to say more about how you think it would intersect. I mean,
I
its
guess
face, it seems relevant, but
I would just, maybe I would couch it and save it because I feel like I've been talking too much, and maybe just like let other people ask questions. But I'll come back to my thinking about Roca's basilisk and the notion of it making predictions, right? Like being the omega and that kind of thing. When Newcomb's paradox is just so small, right? There's only two options. But when we're talking about making predictions, right, that are going to benefit it, it needs course of human, right, existence to go in its direction, and that's massive. Obviously, the kinds of predictions it has to make are going to have to they have to overcome the traveling salesman problem. So.
Yes, if it's doing it in a way that makes sense to us. I mean, there's highly exotic model. There's already this kind of time perversion that comes in with Roca's basilisk, isn't it? Which makes it seem that maybe it isn't actually hacking its way forward in progressive time through a traveling salesman problem, but is involved in this causal trade or some other occult mechanism that is actually taking it outside of that framework of information processing completely.
And I'm really interested in, hopefully, if I write for the class, it's going to be that there's nothing occult about that, and that it's not actually time travel, it's just a simulation that is able to predict exactly how technology is going to unfold in, let's say, like 1,000 years. And from at that place, since it's predicted that, it's as if it already is in the future. Therefore, it can, as we like to say, retrochronically make sure all those predictions come true. So that's, kind of where I'm headed.
Sure. Yeah. No, I totally accept that equation. Yeah.
So,
but sorry.
No, go ahead. It's good.
Well, I was just then going to kind of leap back to this whole, like, there are obviously science fiction writers, I'm sure many more than I've come across who do this, but, who have the whole bacterial, what do they call it, bacterial supermind or something like that, which is very tied up with your DNA computing model, isn't it? Like, it's complicated because it involves so many big things. One of them is this whole thing about, if we take it that orthogonality is tied up about the actual, as a positive engineering achievement of our particular adaptive pathway, is foreclosing certain feedback mechanisms. You're not supposed to be able to feed back into brain structure in certain ways. These parameters of the brain, of lots of inverted commas, instinctive structures and various things that are serving an adaptive function as far as your gene propagation strategy is concerned, are not supposed to be open to rewriting by whatever flights of unpredictable cognitive activity happen in there.
You can't stop your heartbeat.
In the neocortex.
Yeah.
But so a very similar thing is obviously going on if you go back phylogenetically, to this transition to the metazoa out of this bacterial, this bacterial system, aren't they? I mean, the completely, just like high degrees of cephalization of this extreme novelty. So all metazoa are, relatively speaking, extreme novelty in the terrestrial biosphere. And before that, there is much more fluid and complicated feedback allowed between genetic systems. They don't, I guess, even have a really strong sense of genome. They just collect a whole bunch of genes. They can swap them out. They don't have this write-only memory structure where there is a protection against feedback as a constitutive evolutionary achievement that actually defines them, not only, I think, as a lineage, but defines almost what we mean by lineage. You know, if you don't have some kind of right protection system on a genome, can you have biological lineages in any sense that makes sense to us? Probably not. But you then do probably have something much more like the kind of computational genetic network that you're talking about.
Right. Which we're still part, we as metazoa and all the other metazoa, you know, it increasingly appears, are still part of it, but these right protected lineages are and instrumental or instrumentalized by that, develop out of it and become part of that computational network. And it's interesting that it corresponds to, that it's linked with multicellularity, macroscopic size, as opposed to just, you know, the microscopic free-for-all of biomass, which is still, I don't remember what, it's like still 80% of Earth's biomass, or 70% of Earth's biomass is still single-celled protozoan computational free-for-all. It was interesting that sort of the corpuscularization, is that something like that, is linked to being able to have relatively right protected sequences.
Yeah. I mean, this is a systematic set of displacements of things, because obviously it's also a displacement of this whole plasticity discussion, isn't it? And it's a very sort of hazy zone exactly how right protected it is. I mean, you know, obviously you can go full rhizomatic on it, and you know it's all about retroviruses, and the whole thing's porous, and you can take information in and out of the genome, and you know all of that stuff has to be taken seriously. It seems to me, though, that there is a extreme amount of right protection that has been built into.
Yeah, and into the brain as well. Yeah, I mean that's definitely
at the next level. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I actually have a pet theory that that literacy, the invention of writing, kind of fucked that up, like at the brain level, and that Christianity and a lot of religious and social, like the development of the novelized, subjective, you know, autobiographical self and its relationship with Christianity and all of that was sort of reinstating right protection, or was like an ad hoc additional layer of right protection when literacy fucked up the compartmentalization between oral, visual, and symbolic processing in our forebrains. But that's kind of, I guess, neither here nor there. But it definitely does go to this question of what man is, and to what extent we are this this negotiation between technological change and neural change, stretched out over time.
Right.
Yeah.
You can bring in like a concept of like Chesterton's fence. You know, Chesterton's fence. If you see a fence, don't just tear it down. Like, it might be useful there. Like someone like Nietzsche says, like, you know, if you see something that can be torn down, create it. So, and that is the idea of like this conservative idea as well, and that's the whole idea, you know, what we are as man, conservative, and maybe like an AI would actually be a little bit conservative because it doesn't actually know what, you know, it has intelligence in it, but it doesn't know if it tears down all the sort of orthogonal values that it might have emerged with, and it's sort of it's just being lost in the abyss in many ways. You know, it doesn't quite. In many ways, it's going to be relying on trial and error to know what the best way to sort of doing this. So I assume anyway.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I guess it's. I want more about this thing about it tearing down orthogonal values, because it's just like first of all, you have to get those values into the damn thing. Like, how does that actually work? In the first place, the FAO people say, okay, forget all this Asimov laws thing. That's total crap. It's not going to work. You have to somehow make this thing that its values are intrinsic to its sense of self, so that it doesn't want to modify those. The example that Yudkowsky gives is, he says, look, if you'd said to Gandhi, you can change in such a way that you'll be liberated from this sense of not wanting to harm your fellow beings and instead become the new Genghis Khan, how about it? That Gandhi would have said, no, that, of course, I don't want that. I don't want to change in that way, and that's the sort of model, I think.
Well, the opposite way as well. I mean, if you ask Genghis Khan if he wanted to give up, a million, how many millions and millions of offspring or whatever that he sort of, and become Gandhi and become an ascetic sort of religious character, I don't think Genghis Khan would do that.
Yeah.
But Nick, are you comfortable saying that the paperclip maximizer values making paperclips?
Yeah.
Well,
I
I was assuming I was comfortable with it, but maybe
right. Well, it's just because you asked,
should,
you posed the question yourself of what would it mean for like an AI to have a value intrinsic to it, or like to give it value. And so I'm just asking about this one because it's already articulated.
Well, because of the route that I've come to this stuff from, I was sort of taking it almost as axiomatic that the thing that makes the paperclip maximizer want to make more paperclips is what we mean when we talk about a value. And I mean, obviously, one of the interesting things about this is it moves so fluidly between this kind of libidinal and moral register. Like, they just don't even differentiate in any easy way when they're in this. So, you can talk about the paperclip maximizer dutifully making the maximum amount of paperclips, or you can talk about it licentiously producing paperclips. I mean, there's absolutely no significant difference between these two different types of vocabularies. You know what I mean? You could, in a way, absolutely devastate Deleuze and Guattari re-importing this, and talk about, the world of the glorious world of pulsing moralistic machines, and in terms of this, the way this comes up in this friendly AA discourse, you're not transforming anything at all by saying that. The moral fanatic world of the machines, what's shifting. So maybe I should be more concerned about saying that they value making paperclips, but I'm just taking that as a placeholder for this particular distinction between what something wants and what it is. So, and it ought sounds like it's in a moralistic rather than a bit more register, but I don't really know whether that's right. And if you're coming at it this way, you can't really make much of a difference.
Right. Sticky. Yeah. Well, if you have any more thoughts on that, I'd be curious to hear them. If you do find that more problematic, the more you think about it.
I mean, do you have any more thoughts about it, Ian, that you're sheltering from us? Or sheltering us from, I should probably say.
No, not necessarily. No. Nothing burning that I can talk about at the moment.
Sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Sorry, Tony. There was when we were talking about diagonalization right at the start. I've been trying to think about diagonalization, and the thing that's very striking about Cantor's argument and Turing's argument is you have to define two axes which are sort of which are ordering. You have to force an ordering on those two axes, and they're both dealing with infinities. So each of those axes that you set up are they're kind of countable infinities. And then you go through a process of sort of defining a diagonal function indirectly versus the thing that you actually want to contradict. So you don't actually put the thing you're trying to contradict on the diagonal. You actually put a derivative of the thing there. And when you're talking about the way that Deleuze and Guattari use it, it seemed it seemed at least intuitively to me to be related to flow. As soon as you start talking about ordering something and a sort of infinity of something, it seems very much like a flow to me. And so you have sort of two flows defining a field, and then sort of looking at the attributes of that field as an insight into these concepts that you're bringing together. Is that anywhere near where you're thinking, or is that?
I don't know. I think you're sort of hacking into the hind region of this in a way that I'm still unclear about, because it's like the word for this Bitcoin thing that it's taking up a huge amount of my time. The key term in that is current. You know, it's obviously flow. I mean, for sure. But then the question of exactly how to articulate this relationship between flow or current, liquidity, if you're doing it in an economic framework, and the mechanics of diagonalization is not something that I have a clear grasp on. So I mean, I'm super interested in anything that you have to suggest about that, as well as what we've got. It's obviously, I think it's new terrain in the sense that obviously our models, you Google diagonalization, of course you get to these mathematical examples that involve two infinite series that can be strictly mapped onto each other, and so strictly mapped that it seems like you just have one thing until it's actually sort of ripped apart into this kind of two-dimensional grid and used for this purpose of diagonal demonstration. And obviously in the philosophical context, where it's much less overt that there is an actual diagonal argument happening usually, but the model is always a double binary structure. So you have, the distinction between this sort of mathematical model of diagonalization and the philosophical model. I think perhaps the only sort of strict difference between them is that the philosophical model is the minimal possible matrix of a diagonal argument. It's a 2x2 grid, almost always. I mean, I have yet to come across, to recognize a philosophical diagonal argument that isn't this double binary structure. And obviously, as you say, the mathematical ones always are these infinite series, and therefore have a sort of interestingly sort of abstract hypothetical quality. I mean, Cantor's diagonal argument is so utterly weird in the sense that the demonstration is always over the event horizon, isn't it? Like you never settle on the term itself. You don't end up with something like desiring machine or synthetic a priori or some term that you can slap on the table and say, look, this is a diagonal term. It's always, we know by the way we've set this up, that eventually there will be, but you'll never find it because it's kind of beyond the horizon of Aleph null. There will be this number that wasn't included on the grid of countable infinity. So that difference is also. Sorry, I'm probably contradicting myself now. I'm treating that as separate. I think it's the same difference. I just talked about it in a different way. But there, yeah, sorry. I'm sorry to babble. But the connections to flow or current, I'm sure, has to be there. But I'm not. I personally don't have a solid sense of how that works.
Okay, no, that was useful. I mean, yeah, I mean, this thing where it defines more like a field didn't seem. It seemed very present in some of the stuff that Deleuze and Guattari were talking about, and that you sort of, I haven't got a very precise example, unfortunately, but you sort of like define this plausible, recognizable field of things, and it's sort of bigger than just four attributes interacting like in a double bind. It's sort of like more oceanic or something, and then they're like, but actually, didn't you realize that there's these contradictions hidden in this field, that you're oversimplifying things by just thinking of it in this basic mesh.
Right.
But yeah, I mean that's
Yeah.
It requires some more serious sort of digging. But yeah, okay, that's useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to do a lot more digging too on this. Like, there's a whole rereading. I'm absolutely confident that certain capitalism and schizophrenia pieces, I'm thinking like absolutely, especially the Georgian morals, are going to really spit out a hell of a lot on that. Because I think that piece in particular is really giving you some good sort of mechanical support to this, and obviously the whole structure of content expression and substance forms and substances is so explicitly diagonalizing once you start looking at it. But I'm definitely still to do that re-raking process on that.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Sort of went over my head. But, another thing is on UF blog as well, Urban Future, that you say the null hypothesis dramatized. Has anyone seen this, where it was basically like just a website where they have a message? You know, they're waiting for a message from a future time traveler to come back, and you know, if we have like this surely should be possible in the future at some time if singularity occurs, then we should be able to tell her. And there's nothing there yet. They're still waiting. They're still waiting with this sort of message bank. I was wondering what would Anthropol, if they could put a message there, like thinking of putting a message there for the past to see. Is it Anthropol as a Trojan horse? That's mine. But
Yeah.
But, yeah.
That guy, the guy is called Chris Pickover, and he's an absolute goldmine of all kinds of weird stuff. I mean, I really scavenged masses of stuff from him, and this weird thing, it's so utterly bizarrely nonlinear. You just don't know how much humor is supposed to be in it. You know, how much of the kind of paradoxical structure of it is really supposed to be in your face, and what is being communicated about that. Because obviously, like you say, like still waiting for signs of time travelers from the future is just immediately you're in this kind of lurching spiral, aren't you? Like Of course, if it wasn't already subverted, it's never going to be subverted. Or you know, so that just blinking silently to say time travel threat is not yet emerging. It's like there's something I find hugely comical about that. If Anthropol could use it, I mean, I sort of, that's also interesting. I kind of have never really, I've always sort of imagined, maybe just having watched too many Terminator, because I always tend to see Anthropol as the victim of time anomaly rather than the perpetrator of time anomaly. But that's probably prejudice on my part.
It's good enough.
I'm really stuck on this really practical way of thinking about the problem of time travel in relation to artificial intelligence, which I guess I could say that if a simulation believes that it exists 1,000 years from now, because it has successfully predicted everything that will occur in the universe up to 1,000 years, then what's the difference whether it actually is in the future or not? There is no difference. Because
Yeah.
essentially is in the future. So that's the way I think about it. But I actually just wanted to, I shouldn't have said that because I really just wanted to ask you a question in relation to what you kind of last said about Deleuze, which is, and forgive me, I think I'm just slow or I haven't done the readings I needed to with regards to both diagonalism and orthogonality, but with regards to Deleuze and form, substance, and all this stuff in the geology of morals, if I'm not mistaken, you just said that this is a kind of diagonal argumentation. But I take it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I take it to be exactly the opposite, that Kant, yes, starts out with the diagonal kind of argumentation, as you said in the first class, with his distinctions between the a priori and the a posteriori, and the analytic and the synthetic, but that with regards to the geology of morals, D and G are in a way like deconstructing the diagonality there. That right, that like they're actually one and the same. Like the a priori is a process. I can't actually. It's so anti-Kantian. I can't even.
Right. So it's unthinkable.
Right. Isn't it like that? Right. That like the double articulation is both the first articulation is both the second articulation, and the second articulation is also the first articulation. And isn't that anti-diagonal?
No.
Well, I'll tell you where I think it's diagonal, which is really simple-minded, so I apologize that that's right. Which is just that I think they're quite explicitly saying there is a natural or traditional alignment of form and substance with expression and content. That those two oppositions, and they obviously just sort of refer to Hjelmslev like that. And I think it's kind of one of these things that they often do. It's kind of almost explicit, but not quite explicit. But, Hjelmslev isn't a Saussurean because he has divided what in classic Saussurean structuralism is a straightforward form content, what they call hylomorphic model, and they've separated. Hjelmslev separated it out into these two oppositions that are then seen as quasi-synonymous, and they're quasi-synonymous almost just because of their genesis. Just because they've been actually the terms are decided because they've been just pulled apart from each other, and then they are turned into a matrix, and they're turned into a matrix because they then say, yes, you've got forms and substances of content and forms and substances of expression. So you've got that now as your two-dimensional matrix, and the diagonal line of that matrix is the one that cuts across what would have seemed to be straightforwardly paradoxical, self-contradictory, hybrids. Yeah. So by filling out that table, they draw a diagonal line that was excluded by the previous articulation. And then retrospectively, I think that the inability to see that diagonal line is their critique of structuralism. Their critique of structural linguistics, their critique of Saussure, is the fact that what they have now exposed as that diagonal, which they attribute generously probably to Hjelmslev, is the critique. So that's where I'm seeing a type of diagonal argument at work in that case.
Cool. Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna rewind what you just said like 10 times, and then I will.
Yeah, I mean, if
ask another
further,
question.
I can say. But to be honest, it's really simple-minded. I think if you just
No, I
to
totally get it. I'm trying to figure out how to map it onto like Cantor's diagonal argument, and I'm like kind of having confusion as to why we're thinking of it in terms of a diagonal argument. But I will get there.
Well, there's also, this is something I thought, is there's also a way of looking at what Kant is doing at the very, very beginning of the project in the first critique as an orthogonalization, as opposed to diagonal. So, like, prior to Kant, there is an absolute diagonal, or there's an absolute link between the a priori and the analytic and the a posteriori and the synthetic. And then he expands it into a matrix in which there's still a diagonal line below which there's a category that he thinks, and everyone pretty much since almost has thought doesn't exist, which is the a posteriori analytic. But he says the synthetic a priori exists. He prizes the terms apart into orthogonal axes that define a matrix, and it also, by opening up this category, defines a problem that he sets himself to solve, and everybody since, which is the construction of all of these synthetic a prioris that structure experience and arguments for what they are and why they exist. And if we sort of compare that to what's being done by Bostrom in superintelligence with the orthogonality thesis, he is prizing apart. He's prizing apart these two things, intelligence and goals, into two infinite series, and saying, I mean, he doesn't actually say this part, but implicitly saying that there's this diagonal line, which is, and everything above it is intelligence exceeds goal, and everything above that line is possible. Everything below it isn't. And so now there's this huge infinite triangular expanse of options, which include things like paper clippers and genies and oracles and skynets and all of this stuff. And in the same way that Kant says, well, now I'm allowed to talk about synthetic a prioris, therefore I'm obligated to because it's a real problem. Here's my crack at it. Bostrom says these AI monsters exist. These are real threats. Like, we have this real problem, and that problem is this infinite triangular expanse of scenarios which have now been opened up by the orthogonality I'm claiming. So here's my crack at trying to approach these threats, and that we're we're in the same, that's what we're in the wake of.
Yeah. No, that's actually really helpful. That's really interesting, because I would just sort of respond to that by saying, I think that the diagonal component of that diagram that you've so lucidly explained is the basic drives component. The fact that you say it exactly like this, that there is a kind of competence criterion for goals operating at this point, and so the two are connected and can't be fully separated. And it's only after you leave that point that you're then free to explore this world of orthogonal monsters. So yeah, this is a really interesting way of articulating it.
Yeah, it's also interesting that, sorry, I'm just like continuing the same train of thought because I can't help it. That if you think of like what we're doing, right, when we're saying that this orthogonality that you're claiming is bullshit, here is a better diagonal, right? It's almost like redrawing a different diagonal line through this matrix. every redrawing of a new diagonal is also a reordering of both axes, it seems to me, or forces one that you can only have a, so if we're constantly recutting this grid to produce a new, triangular growing expanse of possibilities that we want to deal with, then it can't be the same grid with the same two infinite axes of intelligence and, well, if we don't really want to talk about goals, just say behavior lines, telic vectors, something like that. That in order to cut, so you cut one for like the simplest that I said was that like you can't have something whose goal is unachievable by its intelligence level. So the simplest possible, biggest possible triangle. Then you've got the next one, which is basic drives, and then if we go into like reflexivity, and it's impossible to have this because you have to have a certain certain kind of reflexive loop, a certain way of regarding itself. It has to have a cephalized subject, or doesn't, or if you're Peter Watts, whatever it is. Each of those is cutting this grid, but in order to do so, the things for the space to still be above that line, the order of the two axes of intelligence, the order of the infinite collections that form the axes has to be changed. And it's interesting, just something there. Do you see what I'm saying, Nick? That like every cutting of a new line is the recutting of the orderings that you're using to define the matrix. I don't know. There's something very Deleuzian there.
Well, the ordering. I think I need to sort of walk through this a bit more slowly because look, okay. The cognitive capability access seems to me, is that not like rigidly ordered? I mean, however you're trying to measure this machinic intelligence, you have some kind of quantitative criterion that puts doesn't it put it in an inflexible order on that line? I mean, the difficulty is, I think it's like, it's a beautiful grid, this thing, because it does bring out this as well, but it's very unbalanced in the sense that on one hand you seem to have a very neat arithmetical series of some kind, quantitative series, and on the other one it's very difficult even to construct it originally as a clear ordering, isn't it? Like an ordering. There can be any particular intelligence can obviously have an ordering of its own goals, and any utility schedule does that. But to have some sort of absolute ordering of goals, so in order to sort of to draw this cosmic possibility space of the things that something might want, and to put them in a linear series, is a daunting. I mean, to me right now, it's extremely daunting task. I'm trying to remember how Bostrom even does that, because of course you're totally right that he absolutely does, and I'm trying to think what is the value, what's the metric that is actually organising that second, the telic line on that.
I don't know I don't remember what he says. I mean, my mind immediately jumps to like you want to assume that it's temporal, that it has something to do with like the schedule of your own the schedule of your emergence, or you're achieving ever greater levels of capability, and so but that's me just like naturally habitually diagonalizing again, is that if your goals are all about this self-improvement cycle, then, and maybe this is me just drawing another diagonal line, I guess, so the two kinds of axes we have, so intelligence is only like a strict quantitative schedule if we collapse the space of intelligence onto a line. So you have like, as he says, like there are different superpowers, you can be intelligent at different things. Winning is there's a different point scale of winning for every game, or there's one time each time there is a point scale of winning for each time a game is played in the real world. So in order to say that like intelligence is this generalized ability to be good at winning shit,
Yeah.
like is a way of collapsing many lines into a single abstract line. So if you're saying that whatever this line is, it is one which has a strict ordering, which changing the diagonal we're drawing cannot change because that's what it is, then that means that the other one, the opposite axis, would have to change what it is every time we cut a new diagonal line. And this is so like when Bostrom draws his, it's goals is the other one, and then which you can convert into a utility schedule if we cut it. So yeah, so goals, utility schedule. If we cut it in terms of this sort of self-improvement, reflexive FUM scenario, then it's steps of self-realization, steps in the becoming of some higher, more turbulent thing. I don't know. Like honestly, I'm not going anywhere that's actually like super relevant to the course right now. I'm just trying to. This geometry.
No, I think this is really good, and I think it introduces lots of complicated things. I mean, we haven't talked about this whole question about quantification of intelligence, which is obviously a problematic issue, and it could be approached in lots of ways. So that, for sure, is you could say an off-ramp, whatever, depending on whether to follow it. And then this question of how to draw these matrices. I mean, it seems to me that it's easier on the FUM side, where you just have a clear diagonal, in the sense that you have your two axes are going to be something like complexity or sophistication of structural organization is one, and behavioral competence is going to be, behavioral competence as a kind of stand-in for intelligence is going to be the other. What you're mapping on the diagonal is that your competence and self-improvement is being diagonalized against the structural perfection that you're realizing. And this is obviously what is, so the better constructed you are, the more capable you are putting together improved constructions, and that's the circuit. So it seems to me relatively straightforward. But when you go into Bostrom territory, it seems to me to get much more complicated. Because
it's hard to do in two
once you've got these totally arbitrary goals, how do you do this linearization?
Well, I mean, the other thing that really comes to mind to me, right, is that sort of the way the diagonal arguments work with Cantor and with Turing is use the diagonal to demonstrate the existence of something that is not intuitive, or you didn't think existed before that proof, right? So like something uncomputable, which is relatively unintuitive concept to people, actually. I find, and so Turing is constructing that diagonal to show the existence of one uncomputable thing, but actually the follow-up work now shows that there's a whole universe of uncomputable programs, there's uncomputable numbers, and all sorts of weirdness that you can get out of that. So it's almost like what you reveal from that is not itself ordered, but you sort of make a rip in this field that you define, and that opens up this new conceptual space. So it's almost like, I really like Jake's sort of geometric framing of what Bostrom is doing, but maybe the result of what he is getting is not geometric. The result is, here's this weird new space that I've opened up, and then mapping that as a follow-up.
Yeah. But the two axes, when you draw the matrix, you have series that are at least considered unproblematic at that point. I mean, I totally agree with you, obviously, that what's coming out of your diagonalization, what you're demonstrating, is something in these cases, especially, but probably generally, is something that is it doesn't really exist in geometric space, like like you say, an uncomputable function, a a, 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 a a number that is beyond countable infinity. All of these products of diagonal argument do not themselves actually occupy that geometrical terrain that you've constructed. I totally agree with you about that. But on the other hand, I think the series that are drawing that and that you're resting the whole thing on are absolutely unproblematically serial, well-ordered, aren't they? I mean, obviously it's easiest in Cantor's case, where you simply basically have the number line that's just split apart in the sense of whether it's treated as a sort of lexicographically or numerically, which are completely interchangeable in arithmetic, but you can peel it apart, and so you've got a list of numbers and the actual value of the number, and there's no question at all ever about which number belongs in which order in relation to another number, even if it's a sort of infinitely extendable to the point that you can't comprehend that number. You still know the very fact that it's a number means it must be well ordered. This Bostrom grid, the problematic axis of this Bostrom grid is, it seems to me, at least on the surface, not at all like that. Like an axis that allows you to do a terrain of all possible goal-oriented behavior is like, what is the well-ordered definition for that?
But doesn't it, if you think there is a goal sort of axis or a goal-related axis, then doesn't it come back to utilitarian definitions? In that, that's a very, at the heart of utilitarianism, you have this sort of functional definition of utility, and then there's all these arguments about what that exactly is, but the assumption there is a functional definition of utility that you can calculate and spit out some number. So isn't that very influential in this sort of idea that you can...
Totally, and of course it's nicely quantitative, and so, utilities are a well-ordered series in this sense.
But only in the abstract. De gustibus non disputandum applies.
Right.
Like, no,
Exactly.
there's absolute utility. Isn't it kind of like, isn't it intrinsic that any absolute ordering of utility be diagonalizing? Or
well, I certainly take the first point that what's going to, by just having intensity of satisfaction or whatever is going to be the neat utilitarian quanta there is not going to give you any content in terms of goal orientation. That seems to me how that's not going to do the trick. But I mean, Jake's now the second point of this. I think we might have to say more about. Like,
yeah, I mean, like in the sense that any ordering of goals, any absolute ordering, or not absolute, but any ordering of goals which is supposed to apply to any goal seeker, so any intelligence, in this context whatsoever, is going to be diagonalizing, because the goals should not be ordered. There should be no ordering of goals with respect to anything else if total orthogonality is true, I guess, would be
right.
Not one by one.
Yeah. No, that's worth hardening up into a proposition, because delivered to the right person, that would probably knock something out.
Crash where? Yeah.
Delivered at exactly the right moment, it would be the key to total cognitive trauma.
I gotta remember that.
Okay, I mean, I think we're hitting that point where we are a little bit over time today.
Yeah, sure. How do people feel? Are people ready to? I mean, you're all in different time zones, so I don't know. I'm at 2 o'clock in the morning here, so that's my time
Yeah,
frame.
4 a.m. here, so I'm getting a little bit
Oh
tired.
wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, I'm.
Okay.
I haven't gone to sleep yet, and it's 10 a.m.
Right.
1 o'clock
Okay.
here.
We're on to a kind of final foom next week. Then. Thanks everybody, and have a good week.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much.
Okay.